Hear the word of the Lord from the book of Isaiah, chapter 35, verses 1 to 4. The wilderness and the dry land shall be glad. The desert shall rejoice and blossom like the crocus. It shall blossom abundantly and rejoice with joy and shouting. The glory of Lebanon shall be given to it, the majesty of Carmel and Sharon. They shall see the glory of the Lord, the majesty of our God. Strengthen the weak hands and make firm the feeble knees. Say to those who are of fearful heart, be strong and do not fear. Here is your God. And from the Gospel of Luke, chapter 1, verses 5 to 13 and 18. In the days of Herod of Judea, there was a priest named Zechariah who belonged to the priestly order of Abijah. His wife was descended from the daughters of Aaron, and her name was Elizabeth. Both of them were righteous before God, living blamelessly according to all the commandments and regulations of the Lord. But they had no children because Elizabeth was barren, and both were getting on in years. Once, when he was serving as priest before God during his section's turn of duty, he was chosen by lot, according to the custom of the priesthood, to enter the sanctuary of the Lord to offer incense. Now, at the time of the incense offering, the whole assembly of the people were praying outside. Then there appeared to him an angel of the Lord, standing at the right side of the altar of incense. When Zacharias saw him, he was terrified, and fear overwhelmed him. But the angel said to him, "Do not be afraid, Zechariah, for your prayer has been heard. Your wife Elizabeth will bear you a son, and you will name him John." Zacharias said to the angel, "How can I know that this will happen? For I am an old man, and my wife is getting on in years." This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God.
Where the Desert Blooms. The title of the message is taken from Isaiah 35, which Kathy just read. This isn't a message that Isaiah gives narrating what is currently happening, but what is in the future. Isaiah fully acknowledges the ways that life is broken and the people are in exile, but he plants the seeds of something coming, something so unlikely and almost unimaginable standing where they are. The image is a desert in bloom. Now, the desert is an interesting place. Certain things grow there. Certain things live there. There are things that you want to avoid there, like rattlesnakes. And in general, I would say we are not made. I am not made for living there. Unless you have air conditioning, a pool in the backyard, solar to mitigate your utility bills, and a closet full of sunscreen. But the desert is also a place where there is more going on than you realize. And there is more that is growing than is apparent in the stark landscape. For most of us, we want to avoid it. But what if we had to travel through the desert to get somewhere else? This is actually a photo taken from a trip to Joshua Tree. Now, the Pacific Crest Trail is a 2,650-mile long-distance hike extending from the border of Mexico and California to the border of Washington and Canada. last year, Kate and I hiked part of the PCT out of the Sonora Pass trailhead, which starts at about an elevation of 9,500 feet. And while we were on this little hike of ours, we ran into a bunch of PCTers. They were just past the 1,000-mile mark. Yes, using their feet. What caught my attention was a brief conversation that we had with this British guy who was returning to finish the PCT after he and his son had abandoned it some years before. It turns out the first 700 miles of the PCT are where? In the desert. Known for its extreme heat, its water scarcity, its challenging terrain. Now, it makes me ask this question: who dreams up a trail where the first 6 weeks are in the desert? Only somebody who's wanting to separate the gritty hikers from the casual ones. I include for you this morning an entry from a young lady's journal. Her name is Annika. She talks about her experience in the Mojave Desert. The road does a right turn, and I leave the aqueduct to follow another dirt road. It's extremely hot now, and there is no shade to find. This part of the PCT is especially challenging for the mind. The heat, no shade, monotonous landscape. The trail just goes straight for a lot of miles, she writes. I am in search of some piece of shade for a lunch break, but it's impossible. So I roast in the sun. I can't take it for longer, she writes. There are a lot of squirrels, lizards crossing the road, but apart from that, it's pretty lonely out here. All of you eager to go on the PCT, raise your hand. Yes, as I suspected. Now, the Christian faith has a very interesting relationship to the desert. We have Moses and the people of Israel wandering in the desert for how long, folks? 40 years. That's a long time for those of you counting at home. Elijah ran from Jezebel into the desert where he was fed by an angel. Elijah prayed for death. And the angel said, I think you need to eat some more. Now, Jesus went into the desert and was tempted for how many days? 40 days. That's really an interesting thing. Jesus seems to have had a different take about the desert. He looked at the bleak landscape and water scarcity and extreme temperatures, and he said, can I get a side order of temptation, please? Now I understand. I had never thought of this before. Why did these three meet on the Mount of Transfiguration? There's a picture of them. What are they talking about? Well, they're comparing notes on desert survival. Anyway, one of my suggestions for desert survival is traveling with other people. These are my companions. And yes, when we were in Joshua Tree and it was the middle of the day and your tent was a sauna and there wasn't a place of shade to be found, you were miserable. Well, in the 4th and 5th centuries, followers of Jesus withdrew from normal community and they went to the deserts. Why? They went to the deserts of Egypt and Palestine and Syria to live lives of asceticism, prayer, and contemplation. What in the world is asceticism? Well, it's the practice of self-denial and discipline through solitude and detachment from worldly possessions. And the goal is to achieve more alignment with God's Spirit. They are referred to in church history as the Desert Fathers and Mothers. and I would point out that there is no Wi-Fi there. Now, an interesting thing happened to us. I just throw this picture in here just because it was a strange phenomenon in Joshua Tree, a place where there is no reception. Did I tell you there is no reception? But we discovered, and it was only if you had AT&T, if you stood near this bush tree thing, you got intermittent service. Who from AT&T put something there? I don't know, but yes, just trivia from my life. In spiritual terms, the desert has taken on particular symbolism for us. Maybe some of us more than others. It's a place of solitude, a place of testing, a time of enduring, perhaps, hardship, disorientation. And there's a way in which in those places in our lives, we feel stripped of things that we don't need for the rest of the journey. False strategies that perhaps we've used up to this point in our life, ways in which we've built an identity that is not going to serve us. And so we go through these particular times, and perhaps it's only through those times that we let go of things that we are not meant to carry. There are parts of ourselves that are distorted, and God offers us the opportunity to exchange these broken patterns in our lives for greater freedom in the love of God. Now, understandably, there are times in the midst of these things that we wonder what the purpose is. I have been there a few times where I have wondered, what purpose does this season of my life serve? I recall a season, and I may have told you about this before, in my junior year of college, where I experienced what I would look back on as a dark night of the soul. I sought God like I had never done before. And there were ways in which this time in my life was stripping away things. But as I look back and I think, oh my goodness, as I think about my trust in God, it was like gutting a house back to the framing. I prayed, and God was quiet. What I depended on in the past was not available. It certainly wasn't working. And I even thought I deserved God's silence, which is a whole nother problem. But I do recall, after going through my entire junior year and ended up outside Birmingham, England, doing an internship in a church in the city, that I had this profound moment of realization when I understood God's reality in my life in a way I had never had before. I said simple things in that moment with God. I believe you exist. But I said it from a place that I didn't know before. I think my reliance on God to that point was based largely on good feelings that God conveniently provided. I reasoned to myself that if I do certain things, that God will do certain things. We had this arrangement. At least I thought we had this arrangement until God stopped doing his part in this. And I think, well, understandably, that, it's like with your kids. You relate to your kids a certain way, and you think, oh, now they need a more grown-up way of living. And so you stop engaging them in the same way. You stop responding to them in the same way, and you invite them into something more. You're growing up. So we need to live in different ways. So I had this way of relating to God that I needed to grow out of. Now, it's interesting. I happened to glance in the wee hours of this morning at Richard Rohr's post for today. And I thought, Richard, you've been looking over my shoulder as I prepared the sermon. I hope I could have helped you. His blog quotes Gerald May, who is a spiritual director, who helps clarify what this dark night is about, at least in part. He said the dark night is not somehow this sinister thing that's going on, but that the work that is happening is just hidden, and it's mysterious. And it puts us in a place where we lean into God and we learn to trust more. But there's this awkward place that we live in on our way. Now, we may resonate with this metaphor or perhaps other images that might be helpful. We might talk of being in exile, where we feel like strangers to our own life, strangers in another place, experiencing oppression. We might be in a place where we are longing for clarity, for direction, but it seems elusive. These are difficult places to be. And there are a myriad of experiences, like loss and illness and relational estrangement and financial ruin and any number of other experiences that gut us. And these things are very often intertwined with this dark night. And it can leave us feeling disoriented and emotionally unraveled. Now, one such experience for some in Scripture that plumbed the depths of loss was the inability to have children. The word barren, interestingly enough, was used, as if the womb was a landscape as bleak as the desert. Nothing was growing there. It is interesting to note that all three of the matriarchs of the faith, these would be the spouses of the big three, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. All three of them, in addition to some others, experienced the inability to have children. Interesting. Now, this carried significant religious and social freight, and no small amount of shame. So as we talk about the big three, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, I want us for a moment to pause and just fact check their resume. One of them pawns his wife off as his cousin. Another had clear favorites among his children, and another conspired against his brother. And yet those are the ones we talk about. Here we have these three giants of the faith who did some serious, heavy lifting. And so I don't want us to run past their stories just because we are familiar with them, or because we know how the story unfolds, and because we get to a place in the story that we are far more comfortable with the story and with God than we are if we think about how we would feel if we were on that journey. So, I pose these questions. Who did they become on this painful journey? Have you ever thought about it? What was their journey like? How is this a crucible for their relationship with God? How did they navigate the journey of impossibility? How did their trust get deconstructed and re-narrated for them as God redefined who they were? Maybe we should just stop there and ponder these questions. Now, Eventually, God worked miracles for them, but not before they weathered painful social and religious estrangement. But it turns out that these matriarchs were laying some important track for other people who would follow them. Hannah, the mother of Samson, and our very own Elizabeth. When we meet Zechariah and Elizabeth, they are in the desert. They are in the desert. These are two faithful people. They come from a long line of getting it done kind of people. They're older now, and they were unable to have children. And I wondered to myself, maybe for the first time reading this story, if they didn't feel the need to overcompensate for what they lacked in their life. While neighbors and other priests were balancing their time with children and grandchildren, Zechariah and Elizabeth poured themselves into their responsibilities. I'm just using my imagination. I have no doubt that they spent time grieving the pain of not being able to have children, but I also wonder if they have buried things. Now, side note, I do find it very interesting that of all Mary's relatives, Elizabeth was the one she went to when she heard her news. Perhaps what had hollowed out Elizabeth became a space she could offer to others, a place of deep compassion and tenderness. Now, when the angel meets Zechariah, and there is a back to this, I just found it. If I walk off the back, someone help me. That is my fear for the rest of the morning. I want to be over there. So when the angel meets Zechariah, who wouldn't be afraid? Of course he is. But it's important for us to pay attention to what fear does to us. Recently, I was listening to a message that Dave Lomas spoke, and he said a few things about fear. One, fear has us grasping for control. Makes total sense. You know, if you're the passenger driver and you're driving with one of those people who always drive too close to the car in front of them. This was my wife's experience last night on the Bay Bridge. She goes, could you just put a little more space between us and them? Has the whiteness in her knuckles. Anyway, has us grasping for control. I, on the other hand, think I'm giving myself... never mind. Anyway, but we also narrate the situation in a way that makes us think that we know what's going on. In the back of our minds, we go, I don't know what's going on, but we narrate it in a way that gives us something to hold on to. The third thing that happens is this, that unknowingly to us, especially as we narrate something and narrate something and narrate something, it takes on a life of its own. It becomes something else. Its footprint grows. Yes? Okay, I thought for a second I was the only one who is that skilled. Fear has us focusing on the loudest threat, not necessarily the truest thing that is going on. So maybe turn off your news feed. Anyway, maybe you're not ready for that. But you see, the thing that happens is it fixates us on something. So the pain, that failure, that character flaw, that relational struggle, that vocational detour, that disappointment with its identity-limiting messages becomes the dominant story, and we don't see anything else. Where are we when that's happening? We have entered the desert. And we easily lose sight of what else might be happening. I love what Dave Lomas said when he said this. The storyline of fear, the storyline of fear is imagining the future without God. The future of fear, God is absent. So, we look at Zechariah, we understand that he's afraid, but there's something else going on for Zechariah. I think sometimes we wonder, when Gabriel appeared to Mary and she said, how's this going to happen? Like, she walked away from that experience still talking. Zechariah, zip, zip. You see, Zechariah probed somewhere that was different than Mary. He's telling the angel, have you seen my birth certificate? Have you seen my birth certificate? Like, okay, look at my birth certificate, this is what a birth certificate looks like. I'm too old. You should know that. Whatever God told you to come here and tell me, you should know I'm too old. And have you met my wife? Here's the thing. Zechariah's disbelief is more about opening the door to a story that he had long since closed. That's where he does not want to go. A hope deferred makes the heart sick. So Zechariah is a little resistant when Gabriel shows up and thinks he's going to jump up and down. He's a little resistant to awaken hope to what has been a dormant winter. He's saying, I've written the main chapters of my life. You're a little late. So don't disrupt the stability I've worked hard to create in the arena of disappointment in my life. So Zechariah has this faulty, but I would say highly adaptive construct he's created that allows him to sit in the space of plan B, or maybe it's C or D. Zechariah is not afraid of being a father. Yes, he's afraid that there's an angel standing in front of him, but that's not what unravels him the most. He's uncomfortable with the invitation to trust God in a space that God has not been trustworthy. So, imagine this. For all these years, Zechariah has assembled his toolbox of spiritual practices, and he's probably been very good at doing those things. He's been faithful in ministry. I mean, here he is. He's in the temple. He's doing his thing. He was chosen. And yet there's this unresolved pain still hemorrhaging below the surface. And here we find God showing up and pursuing Zechariah and Elizabeth. Because there's this part of their lives that is bereft of a certain kind of life and beauty and joy. And God says, I want you to have this. I see you, and I love you. And honestly, it doesn't always take the form that we think it's going to. But God is wanting to show up and do things that we have filed away, and we've put it in a room, in a closet, and we've locked them securely, and we don't want to open them. And we've functioned without them. So God shows up, and if we were to take the language of Isaiah 35, he says, I think it's time for the desert to bloom. I think it's time for the desert to bloom. We find some interesting language in Ezekiel, another prophet, Ezekiel 36. The land that was desolate shall be tilled. Instead of being the desolation that it was in the sight of all who pass by. I want us to hear that. Instead of it being this desolation that was in the sight of all who pass by. He said, they will say the land that was desolate has become like the Garden of Eden. Wow. And the waste and desolate and ruined towns are now inhabited and fortified. Remember Elizabeth, his wife, when she thinks about her own situation and the appearance of the angel, and suddenly she's pregnant, she refers to the disgrace she felt in the sight of other people. All who passed by would look at her life with a certain pity. God says to them, I see you. I have not forgotten. I have held this dream for you for all these years. A few questions for us at the end of this message. Where does hope seem most out of tune with your reality? This is something you're probably going to need to think about if you're ready to think about it. Where does hope seem most out of tune with your reality? Where does change or transformation, said another way, seem the most implausible? Where do we set our attention when what or who we have relied on seems absent or unstable? And can we be brave enough to ask, is there a way that God wants to show up? Can we imagine something new? Now, about 8 years ago, I was trying to figure out when was the first time this idea came to mind. And this idea was the idea of a super bloom. A super bloom. How many of you have heard of a super bloom? Okay, a few of you. So, a super bloom is a phenomenon that occurs in the desert, where they bloom unexpectedly and so profusely, like insane. Insane. This is the same place. This is a super bloom. So I wondered to myself, thinking, years later, this would be a great sermon illustration. I knew somewhere in nature there was like this great illustration of God at work, and I just hoped it all aligned perfectly and it was neat and tidy. And anyway, but I've been fascinated with this. So what happens is, and this is the part we don't like, and this might be the part that we're living right now. It begins with a long drought. 1991, when I arrived in San Francisco, funny thing, this didn't happen in the job interviews leading up to it. No one said, oh, by the way, when you get here, we are in a drought. We've been in a drought. We're going to be in a drought. Yeah, you can't wash your car. We're rationing showers. Those kinds of things. No one tells you, oh, welcome to the big drought. We know what that's like here. But the thing is, during this long drought, seeds are accumulating. There becomes this seed bed that is lying dormant. Now, what's the next thing that's needed? Abundant rain. Abundant rain. Enough rain for a period of time to awaken and nurture these seeds. And then, it's a little more complex than that, but this is the sermon version. You get this. What was latent and hidden under the surface comes to life. Okay, here's how I've interpreted this. We have some role to play in sowing these seeds. There are things for us to do. There are ways in which we are invited to live in a relationship with God and spiritual practices. And God is at work doing this. We're not doing this alone, but God is at work and sowing seeds, and things are being planted in us. But there's this other part that we don't have control over. We cannot make it rain. Anyone here can make it rain? I know you can water your lawn, but this is different. So there is this sense in which we also are powerless to ultimately make this happen. We need God to reign. And you might be right there. You're like, anytime now, Lord, I'm ready to get my umbrella out if you just want to make it rain. As we close this morning, I want to encourage us. If your life looks like the left-hand side, don't think that nothing's happening, or that how you've been living faithfully is unaccounted for or irrelevant. You are creating a seedbed. And the invitation is to trust God to bring the rain. God, I need you to bring the rain. God, I need you to bring the rain. And this can be your prayer. God, I need you to bring the rain here in my life. I think there's something else that we need. And I'm adding this. This isn't part of the metaphor. But I think we need people in our lives who have an imagination for hope for us. We need people in our life who will sit with us in the waiting and who can have enough imagination for what is possible, for what is coming, for what we're waiting for. And I would also say, I think there are people in your life who that's you. You need to be the one who is imagining something different with them, alongside them, even when they can't. Lord, help us. Lord, help us. This is the word of the Lord.